In this video, we're going to talk about the rise and spread of Christianity. Did Christianity begin as a peaceful religion, or was it dangerously aggressive? There's a lot of interesting events that happened over the last 21 centuries with Christianity, and we're going to skim over a few of those epics, then go over a little bit of the details. Have Christian morals changed over the centuries? Were the Christian wars justified? Is any war justified? Are people of the Christian states as unified as they were in its inception? You're going to hear a lot about unity throughout this video, unifying a culture with religion and politics. Every culture and religion wanted to obtain peace through unity. There was a lot of bloodshed in this quest for peace. Let's take a look at some of the things that helped with the expansion of Christianity. Christianity began as a sect of Judaism during the time of Jesus, although Christianity soon became almost anti-Jewish within the first few centuries of the Common Era. A guy named Paul is one of the earliest authors of the Christian Bible, and these writings consist of 13 letters, but 7 are regarded as indubitably written by Paul. There are also references in the book of Acts. With these references, here's what it says. Paul became a missionary to spread Christianity. Most of his missionary was in the modern-day Turkey and Greece. He would go into local synagogues and preach Jesus stuff rather than the Hebrew Bible, but the people would kick him out. Although possibly making a few recruits, he would just go with these new recruits and try again at the next place. Paul was, and perceived as, just a Jew from out of town that preached Jesus stuff. This is how he initially won the ears of the Jews, but the Jesus talk then got him kicked out. With a few new Christianized recruits, Paul would then attack the perception of the Gentile who believed in the pagan gods. Well, that's how we identify them now. They didn't call themselves pagans back then. As how the author Paul Stephenson somewhat described it to me in his book, is that paganism was a widely practiced religion before Christianity took root. When Christianity became popular in the cities and centers, mixed with culture and politics, the vast majority of people in this city would assimilate. Then most became Christian, while the outer regions of the country that aren't so well connected with the current political and cultural trends of the majority of people in the cities, they would lag behind in their cultural progress. Paganism is somewhat of another way of saying something like hillbilly. Some people that live out in the middle of the woods or up in the mountains that aren't connected to the people of the system down below. Viruses and gossip spread quickly in densely populated areas. A new social craze could spread overnight and become the latest fad overnight by the next day. Everyone would love it. Ideology spread quickly like weeds in a garden, killing off all the local flowers. If there is at least a potent and ambitious seed, it'll take root. So Paul would go to these urban centers and set up a business. He worked with leather and as a merchant, possibly selling leather and tents, while preaching Jesus to the recipients. Paul says in a Bible reference, "You remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day, so that we might not burden any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God." Paul mentions miracles as a way of persuasion. In the book of Acts, chapter 2, it said that 50 years after Jesus died, there were 120 of these Christians congregated in an area surrounded by hundreds of other people from different regions that all spoke different languages. So the story goes that a spirit sent some wind onto the believers, which then miraculously made all of the believers in Christ instantly to become multilingual, even without ordering a Loretta Stone CD box set. The multilingual Christians then began to speak to everyone from every country in their own language. No translator was needed. I'm not sure if they had accents or not. This miraculous act that is mentioned in the Bible is one of the ways that convinced people to convert Christianity. Peter and Paul and other believers started to get all these superpowers like healing the sick, which then persuaded the pagans to convert and start to believe in Christianity, supposedly. Christians seemed to have tranquil moments in the beginning years, but as Christianity started to get recognized more often, they started to rattle the nerves of the elite of the times. Then by every decade preceding, there would be more and more blood spill. A lot of Christian people that are regarded as saints were stoned to death. Saint Stephen and Saint James the Less were stoned to death. Saint James the Greater was killed by sword. Peter and Paul were taken to Rome and executed. Christians were banished from Palestine area and were forced to relocate in other countries. The Apostle Paul was beheaded, but beheading was saved for the respected individuals that sat on the higher tier of regards, while the people on the lower tier would experience slower death that consisted of torture, So the Apostle Paul was regarded as somebody special by avoiding a slow death. That's kind of cool. In the beginning, Romans seen the Christians as just another sect of Judaism that would eventually fade away, or maybe even continue as some small sect of believers that would end up sitting somewhere along the sidelines. But they weren't so small that they weren't out of sight, out of mind. On July 18th, the year 64 in the Common Era, the Great Fire of Rome began. And the fire began in the merchant shops, in which a lot of the Christians were merchants slash propagators of spreading their religion. The fire lasted for approximately 9 days, and 2/3 of Rome had been destroyed. The 5th Roman emperor named Nero blamed the fire on the Christians. With this accusation, Romans started to persecute the Christians, for which they were blamed for the arson. They didn't kill these Christians for their beliefs, but rather for their supposed crimes. Either way, today they would be called racist. People blamed the Emperor Nero for the fire, but he pointed his finger at the small groups of Christians. According to some dude named Tacitus, Nero had the Christians covered in the skins of wild beasts, which would provoke these wild dogs to attack and kill the Christians. So the story goes, feed them to the dogs. There was a guy named Polycarp, who was a bishop of Smyrna. When he was in Rome, he met up with a guy named Marcion of Sinope, who asked Polycarp if he recognized him, and Polycarp kindly replied that he recognized him as the son of Satan. That must have been an odd moment. See, what I'm doing now is I'm bringing up all these interesting moments in the first few centuries of Christianity, with the big names and all that. Okay, so here it goes. Back to Polycarp. In the year 155 CE, Polycarp was arrested and martyred for his faith. Christians were being executed in Smyrna for not worshiping the emperor. Pagans wanted unity. People believe that there cannot be unity if an opposing faction is trying to change everyone's mind. Local mobs of people went after Polycarp to be persecuted. At his trial, it was said that there were Jewish and pagan people there to witness the event. Then Polycarp was taken to the place where he would be nailed to some wood and then burned. But Polycarp told the executioners that his God would take care of him in the fire, and they didn't need to use nails, so they tied him up instead. And as the fire burned, it supposedly did not affect his skin, so the mob started poking him with spears instead. But his blood put out the fire, and eventually he died from the stab wounds. Big amounts of Christians were killed throughout the first centuries from its inception. Christians were such a small group of people that they had no choice but to preach peace and avoid war. Unlike this great strategic warlord named Muhammad of Islam, he didn't avoid war at all. Some people fight for what they believe in, and others are persecuted. So here's some more persecutions in the early years of Christianity. The year 250 of the Common Era, Emperor Decius made an edict ordering everyone in the temple to sacrifice to the pagan gods. But the Christians had a problem with it, killing for sacrifice. So Decius thought that the sacrifices would bring unity to the people of Rome. The Christians had a problem with the sacrificing, therefore Rome had a problem with the Christians. This led to the execution of large amounts of Christians, while others were put in prison. Pope Fabian was one part of this persecution. Well, he's one of the guys in the persecution. A lot of Christians avoided the persecution by going into hiding, while some converted to the pagan gods. They probably sacrificed some kind of cattle, and then they were saved from death. The sacrifices did nothing magical for Decius, in which he later died a year later while fighting in the swamps with the Gothic people. The refugee Christians were temporarily off the hook for the moment in time. It was called the Decian persecution, another moment in time that nearly wiped the Christians off the face of the earth. In the year 257 of the Common Era, Emperor Valerian ordered universal sacrifice throughout the Roman Empire, and those who did not sacrifice would not be considered Roman, and Valerian was aiming for Roman unity, and the Christians that didn't give into the pagan sacrifices would initially be sent into exile or put into forced labor, but eventually they started killing the Christians. But this didn't last long, because Valerian's son took charge, Gallienus, and he made it easier for Christians to live in Rome. But peace didn't last very long for the Christians, because in the year 303 in the Common Era, Emperor Diocletian and his compatriot, they were both former soldiers, they viewed Christianity as a threat to a Roman tradition beliefs and pagan gods. So they started something called the Great Persecution. He then ordered to have all the Christian churches destroyed, all things related to Christianity destroyed, plus burn all the books and texts of Christianity. Diocletian told the Christians that they would be saved if they would just make a sacrifice and kill whatever animals they could for the sacrifice. The Christians that didn't sacrifice or recognize Roman tradition were tortured, burned, mutilated, while some were sent to forced labor camps in copper mines in Egypt. It seemed like there was no hope for Christianity in the first few centuries. During the Great Persecution, there was a guy named Constantius, which was Constantine's father. He was the emperor of Spain and Britain, and he refused to kill Christians. And some people did not agree with killing Christians, while there was neighborhood mobs that performed peaceful protests that resulted in the death of many Christians. Although I have heard a lot of talk about Christians being fed to the lions during the early persecutions, but being fed to the lions was not reserved for Christians solely. It was a practice punishment for anyone of any belief. In that case, being burned at the stake and beheaded wasn't saved for Christians as well. It was for everybody. Constantine the Great was the first emperor of Rome to convert to Christianity. His mother was an assumed Greek Christian, now referred to as Saint Helena. At some point in her early life, some sources say that she had been a prostitute that grew up in the lower classes of the area. Constantine's father was not a Christian, but he was tolerant of them, as I had mentioned earlier, that he refused to kill Christians during the Great Persecution ordered by Diocletian. As the author Paul Stephenson points out on how Christianity had an effect on prostitutes, it is likely that there was a lot of women that were prostitutes back in those days at the time, and Constantine's mother, being one of those prostitutes possibly, converted to Christianity to move her from the sexy lifestyle she had with sleeping with random men and performing abortions on herself every so often. It was said that abortions were terrible in those days. So if a woman could get married and rely on a husband rather than rely on sex money for multiple men, then the healthier and less stressful lifestyle she would adapt. So that's a possibility why she was Christian, so Stephenson says in his book. Constantine became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire while Licinius controlled the Balkans. And in the year 313, they made an agreement to treat Christians benevolently within the Roman Empire. This was called the Edict of Milan, which stopped the persecution of Christians. But later, Constantine became the sole ruler of Rome by the year 324. Constantine converted to Christianity, but he did not make it the official religion of the state. He made Christianity acceptable and accessible to people that may have had a hard time reaching aspects of the Christian faith. The Edict of Thessalonica in the year 380 made the Christian church the state church of the empire in the year 380. And according to the author Paul Stephenson, a lot of the first people to join Christianity were women and soldiers. Pagans were said to pray to their gods for adversities they had momentarily, protection at war, rain for the crops, and casting spells, while Christianity promised an afterlife. Pagans were interested in hearing about Jesus coming back to life from the dead, while the apostles had the power to heal people. It must have been a hard sale of thought, but it worked. A sociologist named Rodney Stark figures the most probable growth rate of the spread of Christianity would be around 40%, he figures. If you want to get his book and check out Rodney Stark, the author, you can figure all that stuff out because he breaks it down. Christianity then started to become a superpower that was on a quest for given choice of either blood or conversion. Now you can see the tables turn a little bit. There was a woman named Hypatia who was killed in the year 415 CE because possibly people believed she was a witch. And it is written by John of Nikiu. You can find his writings online. It's pretty awesome reading that old stuff. He was a Coptic bishop in Egypt. She was taken to an old pagan temple in which was converted into a Christian church. And these Christians took her there and poked out her eyes and ripped off her arms and tore her to pieces and then burned her. Did I mention they stripped her naked? Yeah, they stripped her naked, they pulled her through the streets and then brought her to this place, the Caesarion, and then they cut her into pieces, poked out her eyes, ripped off her arms, dragged her body parts, and burned her outside the city, and then the smoke would purify the wickedness or something like that. In Alexandria, Cyril was a Christian patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt. The governor was a guy named Orestes, and John of Nicaea wrote that Orestes was close to Hypatia because she supposedly magically led him with her satanic witchcraft. John also wrote that she was into music instruments, which led to a gathering dancing in the theater. Orestes, it's a possibility. Orestes, because it's not really posted. He writes about it, but he doesn't say what actually happened there. But Orestes posted an edict on the walls of the theater while the groups of people assembled in the theater in attendance. And Cyril sent someone named Hyrax to witness the edict and happenings in the theater. But the gathering at the theater, the gathering of people that were at the theater thought that he was only there to cause trouble. So they took him to the center of the theater and tortured him. Then Cyril sent a message to the Jews to cease their hostilities towards the Christians. Then the Jews started a riot in the streets. And then later, the Jews massacred many of the Christians after tricking them to come to the church. The next morning, after hearing about what happened, the Christians started to attack the Jews while turning their synagogues into Christian churches. Then they killed Hypatia. And so I started, from the end of the story and came to the beginning. So there's a movie on this Hypatia. I forget the name of it. Agora, I think it was called. It's a really cool movie. I think it's mostly accurate movie. Pretty cool movie. Check it out if you want. Hypatia. I have another book by an author named Daniel M. Bell Jr., which is about a just war, and we're going to get into that, about how, Christians use that. So anyways, let's keep going here. Modern-day Americans fight for ideologies. Earlier centuries would have seen more blood in the fight over absurd ideas in a culture. There would be more bloodshed. Political leaders would be beheaded. Now that they live in a somewhat civilized society with freedom of speech, they take advantage of that right and fight for the absurd causes. Most early Christians did not believe in war, following in the footsteps of Jesus. It is believed that later Christians used the excuse of a just war, justification of war, calling for short a just war. After the writings of Cicero and Plato, who later influenced St. Augustine and Ambrose, a lot of historians regard Christian violence to the Constantinian shift, when Christians were persecuted some years before, then later became the persecutors. Like Bob Dylan said, the losers now will later to win, for the times are changing. But for the most part of the first 3 centuries, Christians were peaceful and against war. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus disarmed Peter and unbelted the soldiers. Jesus was preaching peace. A few centuries later, we see Christians in battles. Was this because they were a minority at first, a small group of people who needed to stay away from war? But when they became a bigger community, some Christians rose to political power? Was that what caused the Christians to start shedding their peaceful demeanor and start causing bloodshed and war? The author Paul Stephenson wrote a lot of the early Christians were soldiers and women. Women wanted to have sex only after marriage, and they would keep the baby if she got pregnant. Infanticide was popular in the pagan world before the arrival of Christianity, so that's what persuaded a lot of women to convert. But the soldiers were persuaded by the afterlife. Now, the author Daniel M. Bell Jr. wrote that most soldiers that were in Rome weren't all killers, as one may assume. Mr. Bell says that a lot of the Roman military were police and civil servants, firefighters, mail delivery people, accounting, messenger services, general administration, custody of prisoners, public transport, and road maintenance. That being said, so Christians in the military weren't always killers. So that's how a lot of these Christians were in the military at the time in Rome. But even if the militants didn't have to go to war, it wasn't easy to quit the military and get out of it back at that time. It wasn't like, I quit, I'm going home. Christians adopted the concept of a just war from the Greeks and Roman cultures. Aristotle was the first person to use the phrase. Aristotle said that war was to be waged for higher goals and greater good, like peace and prosperity. A Roman author named Cicero wrote that the universe is governed by moral law, called natural law. So the unprovoked wars are unjust. He then concluded by saying that a just war was one of defense and also to right the wrongs that had been done, although not to cause destruction to the enemy, but to obtain peace, relations, and community. So did Cicero think people were going to go out to war and shake hands with people? Ambrose was influenced by Cicero and Jesus alike. Ambrose believed in a just war, although he also recognized that Jesus was against killing. Augustine converted to Christianity through the preaching of Ambrose. Augustine became a bishop like Ambrose did, although Augustine is regarded as the father of the just war tradition in Christianity. Augustine cites Cicero with the reasoning that human society is like a healthy body that should be ordered for the sake of harmony and happiness on the whole. Also, Augustine says, God created humanity to live in a just and peaceable community, and just wars are sometimes appropriate means of restoring and maintaining the tranquility of that order. Daniel says that Christians then began to use rationalization of the lesser of two evils, where a just war is a lesser evil, and the enemy is the greater evil. They also may have considered that Jesus was in a different time and in a different atmosphere, that Christians needed to fight because of the time called for it, while the time of Jesus didn't really call for war at the time. Augustine believed that a just war was a faithful form of following Jesus. Also, that people needed to rely on a just warrior in order to wage war as an act of love for the enemy neighbor. So then there was the Crusades that were created to battle Islamic powers that were invading and conquering Christian lands. The Muslims would destroy Christian cities and towns while killing, making slaves out of the young men who sometimes would be referred to as janissaries, take women as sex slaves, with a very small percentage of them having the possibility of ever being a part of a ruler of a city that if she had a competent son, while the Muslims were converting churches into mosques and little boys into Muslim soldiers. Christian leaders wanted to put a stop to this, and Caliph Umar conquered the city of Jerusalem at the time of the conquest under Muhammad and Abu Bakr conquest for world domination. In the year 1074, Pope Gregory VII called for the crusade to liberate the East. And here is what Pope Gregory said and how he described what was happening at the time. We hereby inform you that the bearer of this letter, on his recent return from across the sea from Palestine, come to Rome to visit us. He repeated what he had heard from many others, that a pagan race had overcome this Christians and with horrible cruelty and devastated everything almost to the walls of Constantinople, and were now governing the conquered lands with tyrannical violence, and that they had slain many thousands of Christians as if they were but sheep. If we love God and wish to be recognized as Christians, we should be filled with grief and at the misfortune of this great empire, the Greek Empire, and the murder of so many Christians. But simply to grieve is not our whole duty. The example of our Redeemer and the bond of fraternal love demand that we should lay down our lives to liberate them, because he has laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Know, therefore, that we are trusting in the mercy of God and the power of his might, and that we are striving in all possible ways and making preparations to render aid to the Christian Empire, the Greek Empire, as quickly as possible. Therefore, we beseech you by the faith in which you are united through the Christ, in the adoption of the sons of God, and by the authority of St. Peter, Prince of Apostles, we admonish you that you be moved to proper compassion by the wounds and blood of your brethren and the danger of the aforesaid empire and sake. For the sake of Christ, you undertake the difficult task of bearing aid to your brethren, the Greeks. Send messengers to us at once. Inform us of what God may inspire you to do in this matter. So that is what Pope Gregory said in the year 1074 in regards to the Muslims taking over Europe and killing Christians and so on and so forth. The Crusade ambitions in 1074 never actually took off full force until the year 1095 in the Common Era. So he was talking that stuff 20 years ago, or maybe 21. And during that 21-year span of time of stagnation due to internal problems, the Christian people would witness the loss of a lot of Christian Asian Minor. In that span of time, important cities were lost to Islam at the time. People were pleading for aid up until Pope Urban II stepped up and sent the first crusade to help its people. Pope Urban said, "Your brotherhood, we believe, has long since learned from many accounts that the barbaric fury had deplorably afflicted and laid waste the churches of God in the regions of the Orient. More than this, blasphemous to say, it has even grasped in intolerable servitude in churches of the holy city of Christ, glorified by his passion and resurrection, grieving with pious concern at calamity, we visited the regions of Gaul and devoted ourselves largely to the urging of the princes of the land and their subjects to free the churches of the East. We solemnly enjoined upon them at the Council of Auvergne the accomplishment of such an undertaking as a preparation for the remission of all their sins, and we have constituted our most loved son, Admir, Bishop of Puy, leader of this expedition and undertaking in our stead, so that those who purchase may wish to undertake this journey should comply with his commands as if they were his own, and submit fully to his losing or binding as far as shall seem to belong in such an office. If, moreover, there are many of your welcome whom God has inspired to this vow, let them know that he, Admir, was sent out with the aid of God on the day of the Assumption of the Blessed Mary, and that they can then attach themselves to the following. In this letter, the instruction for those who would go out on the crusade. Pope Urban II in calling the relief of the Christians in Jerusalem. So not all crusaders were just wars now. You think these are good guys, like liberating the women, the sex slave women, and then the slave boys, right? But no, not all of them were good guys, because then there's a fourth crusade. But not all crusades were bad, not all of them were good. And crusades were assembled for the relief of the Christian states that were attacked or conquered by Islamic forces. But when the fourth crusades were assembled, there were far more soldiers than expected to fund. So when the Fourth Crusade came together, they said, come on, let's go, guys. And everybody showed up, and there was like thousands more than they thought. And he was like, man, I can't pay all you guys. And somehow this led to the invasion of a Christian army fighting for Christianity, but attacking Christian cities instead. Firstly, they attacked the city of Zara in Croatia. In the year 1202, the crusade invaded Zara, but Venice had been invading the city multiple times for decades during the 12th century. And in 1202, they completely destroyed the city and robbed them to fund their people. Although the wealth they obtained from the siege was hardly enough anyway, so they're like, why the hell did we even come here? But anyway, sorry guys. Pope Innocent III excommunicated the Venetians and Crusaders after that. Later, the Fourth Crusade would make their way to Constantinople. And by the year 1204, they conquered Constantinople and took it over. And the Fourth Crusade is mostly to blame for the fall of Constantinople. It seems that these Christians started to use any excuse they could for a just war. Those jerks. So depending on what source you read, the last crusade was defeated by Islam in the year 1291. The last Crusader state. When the Muslims took the city of Acre, there were smaller sects of armies like that in Spain to help push out the remaining Muslims in the region. But European states lost a lot of the battles to invading Muslims forces at the time. But Europe had grown stronger commercially while obtaining better trading and transportation with shipbuilding in response to the wars. And after the Crusades, there had been said that people started to have more interest in travel and learning about different things, Yeah, right. Anyways, Louis the Ninth, the King of France, was the leader of the Eighth Crusade, but he died in the year 1270. And the Crusade was left to battle two opponents, which were the Muslims and the Mongols. And the Christians of Antioch, before that, had joined the Mongol forces, or the Mongols joined the Crusade forces to help them win back Aleppo. But the Christians of Acre were too proud, and their pride led to their defeat by the huge Islamic army of the Mamluks in the year 1291. Yeah, but the Christians were not only fighting Islam and the Mongolians. There was also the Inquisition. They were fighting each other. And there was the Inquisition that started somewhere around the 15th century, with the Spanish Inquisition being one of the first and largest, in which was started by Pope Sixtus IV. Later, other states would adopt the practice, and even the Inquisition reached America. It was abolished in Spain by the year 1834, and the Inquisition attacked those that were Protestant Christians, Muslims, Jews, witches, scientists, and other sects of Christianity that weren't Catholic. But the Inquisition wasn't the only thing that was coming after people, and there was other crazy people like Mary the First of England. She was referred to as Bloody Mary. She was the Queen of England and Ireland in the year 1553. She was a Catholic that preferred everyone else to be Catholic, and those that weren't Catholic were persecuted. And Mary had over 300 of those Protestants burned at the stake. And because back in the day, when the people burning at the stake was like a really common thing, because they believed that when they were burning people, they were completely getting rid of the bacteria that made them not Catholic or Christian or whatever. But anyways, Christian people started as a peaceful people, but eventually succumbed to just wars. And with early persecutions, Islamic and Mongolian invasions, Christians had to step up their game. And humans are usually humble when they're the minority, but they become ruthless when they become the majority group, or one of the popular thought, right? And anomie was a term used by a sociologist, Emil Durkheim, to define the feeling of being disconnected from the norms of society. But today, people are more disconnected sincerely on a personal level, while being more connected to people than ever in history through electronics. Like the author Gene M. Twenge writes about how people in the 1950s and 60s would have all the things to talk about because everyone watched the same movies and listened to the same music and went to the same churches and they knew all their neighbors that lived on our whole block and so on and so forth. In contrast, in modern times, a lot of people barely know the neighbors right next door to them, but they do keep good communication with the people that live many miles away, even with people that live in other cities, states, or countries. While the online community could be viewed as a bunch of trolls that a decent person would never expect someone to say in public, but they do online because they're disconnected. And you see all these wars throughout the centuries was bringing unity to people, but are we closer together, or are we farther apart with culture? In our culture, religions like Christianity and Islam aim for unity, and with unity there's peace. And as soon as there's division, then there's a fight for power and control, which leads to persecution, death, shame, and belittlement, and a whole mess of other bunch of terrible things. And political and religious differences sometimes break close families apart. And Muslims would kill their own brothers to avoid a fight for power. And Christian kings would have their wives' heads cut off. And one early American colonist had his wife killed and he ate her when he was hungry. Humans will do whatever they can do to get on top of it at the cost of others, and then spit at those underneath them in between their generous financial donations. It doesn't matter who's in power, there's always somebody that loses. The Christian church first preached unity and kindness and good behavior, and to also stand against heresy. These were the original teachings that the apostles taught early Christians. And modern-day Christian states now unify in separate groups, which sometimes fight each other for power and control. And their kindness is selected objectively based on our standards. And modern-day heresy is anyone who objects to one's belief. I actually saw a transvestite the other day threaten to kill or beat someone or anyone that didn't accept their preference of identification. Pretty crazy. So yeah, that's a concise rundown of Christianity and unity and culture and Western civilization and all that stuff brought in all one video. So that's it. Adios. Yeah, I never say subscribe and hit the like button, but I don't know. Do I need to? Do I need to say that? Adios.